So this panel is called Recognizing and Honoring Indigenous Sovereignty in a Digital World. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. And we'll start off with Chief James Hobart to my left, and then we'll do Linnea and then Davida, and then I'll sort of give you each a chance to also, after your introductions, sort of, speak to what Indigenous sovereignty means to you in the sense of the broadband and digital world. So, Chief James.
Good morning, everyone. I say Yudekshewinwen in my nation, Azuman Quenched in Squenched. I would like to say, first of all, thank you to Brittany for welcoming us to this amazing territory, and thank you for bringing in Wilson. Doesn't everybody feel like, for at least split second, you were there, like back when, right? That was amazing. With Chief James Hobart from the Spuzzum First Nation in the Fraser Canyon, and I just wanted to say thank you for having me here, and hopefully I can insert some stuff that's going to make sense, and if not, then I'm going to hide.
Hey everybody, my name is Linnea Jackson, and I'm a member of the Hoopa Valley Tribe in Northern California. I actually, my mom got a nursing degree when I was young, and so I was raised in Anchorage, Alaska, and I have a lot of love here. I feel Alaska is part of my home just as much as California is. So to hear the land acknowledgement stuff and to hear, say it again, Brittany? Delmar. So they didn't acknowledge that when I was growing up here. So to see that transition, later on, and the resurgence of that is really important. So again, Hoopa Public Utilities General Manager, it is an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you for welcoming me.
Ja, it's she Davida Delmar Inisia, be Patonisle, Dol Ketlachine, Bashachin, Kiani Dashe, Dol Torachine, Dashanella. Hello everyone, my name is Davida Delmar. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I'm coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona, and very humbled and blessed to be here for sure. The welcome was great, so I'm excited to be here and share more about the work I do. I actually work for AmerInd Critical Infrastructure. They are based in Santa Ana Pueblo in New Mexico. So they do insurance, but they also do broadband. And they helped with tribes. They contract with tribes and to help them with their broadband infrastructure from the beginning to end, or continuing that relationship. But part of my role is actually to work with the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, where we run a digital navigator program, which I will speak to later in the conference. But yes, it's been such a pleasure to be here and to learn more about everybody. I think this is a very good space. I was here last year, but only for a day, so hopefully the next 3 days is going to be fruitful. So thank you.
Thank you. I just kind of realized I forgot to introduce myself. Madeleine Redfern. I'm from Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunavut, situated on Baffin Island. Interestingly enough, in Alaska, I find no one knows really past Yukon. They forget that Northwest Territories or Nunavut even sort of exists. I'm currently the COO of CanArctic Inuit Networks, which is working hard to bring in fiber optic cable into Canada's Arctic, and it isn't an easy journey. And I did attend the first Indigenous Connectivity Summit down in Santa Fe, and I can tell you that it's been absolutely fantastic being part of sort of the network, the Indigenous network, not only within Canada, but North America and beyond. So this topic of recognizing and honoring Indigenous sovereignty in a digital world is something that, without a doubt, is getting greater momentum, greater understanding of the necessity and the value. And so maybe, I'll ask you, if you don't mind, Chief James, to share, what does that mean for you and your Indigenous peoples?
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the question. So sovereignty is a huge piece of what we're striving for in Canada. But there's 204 First Nations in the province I'm in British Columbia. And so there's 204 different protocols and policies that need to be acknowledged and also respected. And so I wouldn't want someone else telling me what my sovereignty looks like, and I wouldn't dare tell others what theirs looks like. So for us, it's been about a journey that free of tribal councils, free of any other political bodies that were in place, were put in place for, post-contact. We're trying to get back, just like Wilson was talking about, getting back to that time when we were able to connect with and feel those connections of what it means to have the connection to not only the land, and which is what he was talking about, and but also the connection to a way forward for the next generations. And so I think, you know, for us, it's been a struggle because the government has their own interpretations of what that looks like, and they will tease you with different things, and they'll come to the table. And so we've started to learn about how their structure works as well with the government. And I think that that's a key point to push it, to realize that they're even though they want to say what you want to hear, they're not your friend, and they're also not telling you all the goods, right? They'll take you to a certain space in time, and it's like they figure the pendulum is swung to the middle now. We can all talk evenly and openly. And I want to tell you that dog don't hunt, not in British Columbia anyway. We have to make sure that we're putting ourselves forward, and not only just forward to where it's going to come to some middle ground, that we need to make sure that we're pushing that pendulum further. And so if they're offering you something where it looks like it's an amazing opportunity, usually there's something around it that's left to interpretation. And there's a lot of cloning that goes on with one ministry replacing themselves with the next level of the younger people coming in. And it seems to be an ongoing story that we keep coming back 10 years later. That's what in BC, they use the term 10 years. 10 years ago, we were talking about this, and those people would say the same thing about 10 years before that. So the thing is that we have to make sure that we're not guilty of allowing that to happen. We have to review our own words and not leave things like recommendations and possibly and maybe and, you know, possibly. We have to make sure it's expectations. And this is it. We're going for stuff. This is what we want. And at the end of the day, this is what we're going to get. And so if you're going along in the same path and not deviating from that, the government starts to listen, because they'll start throwing things in your space, and they'll think, well, aren't you happy? We just gave you white space, right, or whatever. And I was like, no, we're not happy. That's not what we're wanting. But at the same time, they'll dangle it like as if, well, everybody else is happy with it. Why aren't you? And so that's what I'm saying. You have to really make sure you're pushing the boundaries for yourself, for your nation. And I think it's a perfect environment for it. I think the governments are coming to a place where they have to do something because people are watching. And I think that that's our biggest asset, is the people that are outside looking in and going, you know, you've said you've dealt with this issue with the First Nations, and, you know, when they talk about the last mile of connectivity, and I think that they've camped out on the finish line, and for a lot of nations. Anyway, Cook's Jim.
I hear your frustration. I also hear the fact that, you know, you understand where you want to be and versus where the government wants you to be. So Linnea, can you possibly share what, you know, your journey, or those that you work with, you know, in your Indigenous community's journey in trying to get your Indigenous sovereignty and, you know, respected and also honored in the way that your community wants it to be?
Just like the chief mentioned, you know, the state of California has the most tribes of any other in the United States. There's 109 federally recognized, and even more that aren't recognized at this time. So that's a lot of space to share. That's a lot of initiatives. That's a lot of different perspectives from tribal nations. When I talk about digital sovereignty, it's going to look different from anywhere, but I think the premises that remain the same are, you know, the protection of your cultural resources. It's owning and having the ability to have those frequencies and spectrum. So now we're not just talking about, you know, the land or the resources. There's also this asset that is above the sky, and we say, you know, the land and the sky. And now there's spectrums that have value, that have needs that we can use for emergency services, cell phone connectivity, broadband. So it's also being in that space and claiming that over tribal lands. So I think digital sovereignty also for tribes is either owning, managing, or guiding whatever that infrastructure is going to be on tribal lands. It's training your own. It's the workforce development. It's the economic development that comes with training your own people, because a lot of us live in rural areas that don't have providers that can come and, you know, fix a break. So we have to have those resources within our own tribal governments. And from Hoopa's standpoint, we are trying to train our people to whether that's, so we're building out, which I'll provide more information tomorrow, an underground fiber network, but we also have to be able to manage that as well and fix that as well. And we're negotiating with the state of California on being that management service. And so it's the protection of cultural resources and economic development and your emergency services, and having the tribe be able to guide that and say how that network looks at. So I think that's what it looks like for Hoopa.
And Davida?
Davida?
Oh, sorry, my apologies. Davida?
Davida, yes.
I struggle with more words with more than 3 syllables, including names.
Oh, no problem. Usually people say David, and I tell them, that's my dad, that's not me. So yes, that's a really great question, and I'm humbled to be on this panel because I'm not a tribal leader like Chief Hobart, and I don't work for my tribe, such as Linnea, and doing a great job at both. So for me, I come from a space of like a person who is managing this collaboration between Native and non-Native. So it's a touchy area because, of course, Linnea already pointed out that even within California, everybody's different. Everybody has their own space and resources that they would like to manage. So it's the same, of course, for across the nation, and of course, worldly as well. So this ability to not only set expectations, as the chief said, but also to recognize the fact that with the capacity and capabilities to manage and own and guide those resources is really important. So I think first and foremost, I think a lot of folks need to set a digital equity vision for how they want to do that. So recognizing that, defining it within their nation, what it means for them is definitely important. But also, of course, within those managing and owning aspects, it's the fact of being a resource for accurate, reliable, detailed information. And that means data sovereignty too. So ensuring that our homes are being represented, the people who are, different facets of it, if it's demographics that are important to, you know, the work that we're doing, that it's accurate, that it's up to date, and that it's going to be informative for folks who are non-native or who aren't part of our tribal communities. And I think we also need to empower existing community programs, because I think when I encounter people talking in broadband or digital equity, they think that we haven't done this before or whatever. And actually, there's a lot of programs out there who are working towards digital inclusion for 30, 25 years, you know, ever since, you know, we've heard the word internet, or, you know, have started using computers in our communities to an elevated level. I think empowering those communities that are existing and those experts that are there is definitely important. And that includes tribal leaders too. And of course, also we need to take those programs and the knowledge that we have, and NDIA likes to use this word coalition building, which is great. I don't know if that actually fits within tribal communities, but the fact that we need to recognize what people are doing in various departments, whether it be broadband, health, education, government, and ensure that we're talking to each other, communicating. And I think through that, we're able to, you know, establish establish our self-determined goals, you know, our self-determined ways of doing things, especially for whatever tribe that you're working for or community that you're working for. And for me, that's hard because I work on behalf of a lot of different tribes. But I'm learning every day, and especially now too within here, so I'm hopeful to learn from everyone as well.
Would you mind if I added another comment?
Absolutely,
Okay.
go ahead.
So if I have to say it right when it's in my mind. So another thing about digital sovereignty is also the tribe's ability to self-certify and provide our own data sets instead of relying on like the FCC mapping or the money that these large investors are getting in to say that they claim and serve that area when we all know that they largely don't. So I think that's another issue with sovereignty, is being able to provide and substantiate our own data and our own figures and our own numbers for the area that we're serving.
Excellent. I'm glad, because, you know, the definition of sovereignty is having that dominant power and supreme authority, controlling influence that allows for representation, but also representative data. And what I also heard is, you know, the ability to build and own and manage and serve your own people. So both with respect to the data that you need to be able to influence, you know, sort of policies and access the funding, but also build out that infrastructure. And then that infrastructure is moving data. And so it's almost full circle, you know, with respect to that. So I want to ask and bring in the whole concept of Indigenous reconciliation and Indigenous economic reconciliation, and how those concepts now, are they influencing, you know, government with policies and programs in a way that serves our people? Or I almost heard earlier with, you know, Chief James, is that it's maybe just taking us so far, but not where we need and want it to go. So, you know, could you share, and maybe I'll go in the opposite direction, and I'm going to Davida. I'm trying so hard. I wrote it down.
That's okay.
Davida. You know, so what role does Indigenous reconciliation or Indigenous economic reconciliation play in this area of digital sovereignty, Indigenous digital sovereignty and data sovereignty?
So I probably won't have the best answer, but they're probably going to do better than my perception of reconciliation is something that we're always working towards. It's probably not going to be something achieved. I think when we look at digital equity and the goal that we're trying to have for us, also reconciliation, ensuring that we're keeping everyone's voices in the community, to recognizing it as well as acknowledging it and using it to take action in a sense. So I think in that sense, a lot of people, it takes a lot of work, and it's, I don't know if it's achievable for everyone. So I think reconciliation is something that is a good goal and that we can strive towards in terms of how we're working with tribes and communities. I think the barrier so I'm from the US, so when we're working with state and federal programs is when we're establishing these different partnerships and talking about, we have this digital equity money, you know, that's required to work with tribes. That requirement piece is just, you know, kind of sets up a barrier for me, and say, I think a lot of states and federal programs need to come to us and say, like, we want to do this. We are here and welcome, and we want feedback because of the land that we're on, the resources that you manage, and things like that. Because oftentimes, you know, this requirement to work with tribes can also be a barrier in a sense, because a lot of them act like it's the first time they're working with tribes, and which really it's not. You know, we've worked with them in various capacities in terms of water, energy, and other resources we've managed. So I think it's important to know and acknowledge the fact that you know, we've partnered with tribes in the past and tribal communities, and that we really need to strive and move forward in a good way in terms of how we're managing broadband and internet. And so I think, and that can mean a lot of different things of knowing how we use this resource with our economic development. And economic development is just not businesses and commerce, but it's also how we're building our workforce, how we're building education, how we're also building our the health capacity of our community members as well. So I think it's important to have a multifaceted approach when we're working with tribes, and not in so narrow a way in terms of how we're working with broadband and infrastructure, but also how we're looking at how people use the internet and the capacity, or not the capacity, but the opportunities it offers to our community members for the future. And I think we're always looking, I think a lot of folks look 7 generations forward. I also just say, what do we want to leave for our grandchildren? You know, I think that's a tangible vision for us, a lot of us, of like how we want our grandkids to use the internet in the future, and how does that look like, and what is the potential that we see there. So
It definitely sort of shows that holistic approach that our Indigenous nations sort of take to any sort of resources, you know, how one essential element can have such a big, you know, wide impact, and how interrelated and integrated, you know, this technology can play in education and healthcare, not just in economic development, you know, or just, you know, providing that telecom service to residents or businesses. Would you like to add?
Yes. So say those 2 phrases again: Indigenous reconciliation and Indigenous
Economic reconciliation.
Okay. So from the state of California, the governor offered an apology to Native tribes in 2019. That is 4 years ago. So when you talk about the reconciliation of that, I mean, that doesn't obviously solve or take away any of the things that Native people have gone through. But think about that. That was 4 years ago when that apology was issued. And like Davida said, they act like they, you know, have never worked with tribes before. But I think it's on behalf of tribes to step up and push that sovereignty. We all have a seat at the table, but it's government to government relationships. There's no subordination there. And I think it's really important for the tribes to push that. When you talk about the investment that's come largely because of the pandemic and COVID. And I know that was a harsh thing on the health front, but that was an investment into tribal nations who lacked, where the schools were shut down. People were working from home and had to the telemedicine wasn't there. And so that infrastructure provided the long-standing lack of investment that we've needed. But that can't be the last thing. So when you talk about economic reconciliation, there's so much there. And that funding needs to continue. That's going to be up to the tribes and the voices in this room to keep pushing that, to keep wanting and requesting funding on the digital equity, on the investment, because anyone that's out there building a network, you have to replace those electronics, you have to replace the radios. Ongoing maintenance that largely cannot be supported by small rural Native communities, and so that investment needs to be ongoing. So the reconciliation is there's a long way to go to that. I think there's been a resurgence in that, but it's going to be up to the tribes to push that envelope.
Thank you. And Davida, you did an awesome job, by the way. That was good. Yeah, you're doubting yourself, but I thought you covered a lot. Every time you ask the government for something and they'll say something, they scurry back and they try to figure out the interpretation of what they've just offered you. So you need to be mindful that just because you're asking and they're agreeing and nodding, that's just part of their play, right? They have that's what they do. And so this is actually in Canada. I don't know if it's across the continent, but but at least they opened the door recently, right? They've opened the door for us to go in and talk. And what I think we need to do is tell our story. And our story should sound, my story at least sounds something like this, that we've watched the settlers come and build. They've built retirement. They've built their kids' education to put them through university. They've built wealth. They built lifestyle on the backs of our resources. When people understand that they're living in a place where they've done it at the expense of someone else's unceded territory, there are resources that have never been, handed over. And when people, when they come out of there, sometimes we've had our discussions, embarrassment is a little bit of, we need to finally got a shot of awareness that, maybe their answers didn't play fair with ours, right? And we need to get them to that space. And the reason why I say that is because the government, even if they're going to try to push for First Nation economic and digital sovereignty and reconciliation, they need to have the taxpayers on board with it. and the taxpayers are seeing a certain way and they don't understand. Now the government is trying to figure out a way of telling our story so that it makes sense when they give us something. They're already thinking they give us everything. And so we have to make sure that they know that they haven't. Up until now, it's been, you know, a shell game where they've promised something and then they've moved it back, right? And so what I want to say around that is, if you look in the province of British Columbia, we're the first province that's implemented DRIPA, is called. It's the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So everything now through our government is filtered through that. I say that knowing that a lot of the other provinces have envy around that. And I'll tell you where it fits with the economic, or with the digital sovereignty. When I first mentioned UHF Spectrum to our premier, which would be like your governor, his eyes glassed over, and I didn't blame him. UHF Spectrum, like, you know, that was to him was something that, you know, they used to turn an antenna on the old stump to make Bonanza come in clear, right? And so that's what they were thinking. So now they move ahead to this, and now they get it. And the province of British Columbia is actually pushing Canada with us now, and that's not normally heard of. It's where the federal government, who actually manages the spectrum in BC in Canada, we go to them and they give us a little like a little token here and there of release of the spectrum, and 1 year renewable permitting. Never a chance to get full funding for a project, because you have to have 5-year project in order to get funding. So they're holding you hostage in Canada for exactly what they're promising. So what I like to say is we've watched others build success on our resources. We've also seen the water problems we have in Canada and in the U.S. at First Nation level. If they can't get the spectrum, which is there's no infrastructure needed to release it. It's just a matter of spilling the ink, right? If they can't get that right, I mean, and the taxpayers are looking, how are they going to get the water where that takes millions and billions of dollars of infrastructure? How are they going to get that conversation even off the table or off the starting line, right? And so what I'd like to say is that we need to make sure that we're telling our story, but not allowing people to interpret it in a way that it looks like we're going to be okay with any sort of placating where they're going to give us something, you know, part way, you know, and that really has to be an intent, is not go away. And so I think that is why the province of British Columbia is helping us, because they know, they see that we're pushing and we're not going to go away. And you know, the reason why I say that's important is that they know that they're not pushing alone, that they have somebody out there that they can stop and say, tell them why we're pushing, right? Because they don't know the whole story, but we do. And so we have to, first of all, go back, learn what we're talking about, and then make sure that you can share it with the government in a clear way so that they can get on side with it, because they already feel, I think, in a lot of ways that they can actually come ahead. Nobody's going to be standing there protesting on any legislative ground saying, don't release the spectrum to the First Nations, except for maybe the big telcos, right? And so I talk a lot about the spectrum because BC has a lot of remote communities. And those remote communities have been promised 2025. Now they're promised 2030 for connectivity through satellite and through fiber. I'll tell you, if you were in BC and you look at the map where fiber stops, it stops at my doorstep. We're not allowing it to go through because they want to pay us tax as it goes through our reserve. And we're saying, no, it's worth more than that. And so we've stopped them, and now we actually have to aggressively look for another solution. And you know, necessity is the mother of invention. We see the UHF spectrum release, and we've seen it work in pilot projects where it's faster than the other opportunities to connect, cheaper, and actually more stable than any of the other options. So I say that we, in BC at least, we're pushing in a direction that is going to allow us that economic stability through reconciliation of the digital equity. And I'll just give you an example. You know, imagine if a court say you have to go to, if we're in a court situation where somebody has to be assigned to a recovery house. In BC anyway, the courts say that recovery house has to be connected has to be online for tracking, the ankle bracelet tracking. And so we have all these beds in these different places that are remote. And Indigenous people, the best place they can recover from stuff is out on the land. But we're not allowed to send people there because they don't have connectivity. So the UHF spectrum is already there, so we can connect. So I think that it's a struggle, and we gotta realize. I saw snake oil on one of the future tables. And I think that one of the snake oils that we've been dangled is, if you ask for UHF spectrum, they'll say, we'll give you white space. You have to make sure that the government knows you're aware of the options, and you're not going to take those options, because they're going to say, here, we'll give you this. And then that conversation may take you months before you get back around and you realize what you just agreed to is not what you really wanted, right? So learn what you want, express it, and be aware, and let the government know that you're aware of the different carrots that they're dangling in front of you, and that you don't want to bring it up again. Don't bring up white space the next time we talk. That's out of the question. And then watch what they do, because they'll have to scramble to get you the option that you're looking for. Cook's Jam.
So I'm really glad you brought up spectrum, because it's something that I think is starting to become more aware in Canada, and it already exists in the United States and in New Zealand. I know that ISED is now actually sort of starting to do consultations on it, and what I just want to put sort of in perspective is that the government of Canada sold about $7 billion in recently in spectrum, and our telecom sectors were $70 billion. So it's like fisheries, it's like water, it's like minerals. It is absolutely a resource that has value and that has and permits sort of economic development based on it. In the United States, it's the digital economy is worth $2.41 trillion, and in my experience is that we simply have not had the same sort of access, to that resource to build out our telecommunications network and our digital economy as a result. So what I want to ask is, having a dedicated Indigenous spectrum, is that good enough? Or in the sense of the States or in New Zealand, dedicated Indigenous infrastructure funding and also a national office or regional Indigenous office that allows the nations to be aware of that set aside, and how to help build that capacity, how to access that funding, how to manage those projects, and so that we're asking for the right stuff rather than just sort of like being sort of what's that, a shell game, where you sort of like what you want is this and what you get is something else. So how important is Indigenous spectrum and all the ancillary sort of aspects of that to maximize our participation in this sector? Maybe I'll start off with Linnea.
So there always should be a tribal set aside. Let's just say that, right? We have different needs. We are different government structures. There always should be that Indigenous money set aside for whatever there is. When you talk about a dedicated spectrum, that's going to look different from all of us. So if you talk about Hoopa, we're in the mountains, there's dense forests. The same spectrum that works there is not going to work somewhere else, and vice versa. There was so the FCC issued the 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal priority window. It was the first time that they ever had that available for tribes, and it was part of the education broadband spectrum, the EPS. And so many tribes applied for that spectrum, and it was supposed to be able to permeate through the trees and dense foliage. And when we're doing bench testing, when we're building out our network, we decided that it wasn't performing as necessary. Part of that was equipment, but part of that was because line of sight was an issue. So I think having dedicated spectrum, I think it really needs to be the opportunity for tribes to have that first right of refusal, and to know when the FCC is issuing those licenses. So when we first started getting into this, licenses on our tribal land that we had no idea that were even issued. And, if they're for like a really long period of time. And it's just like crossing tribal borders. And so that's why it's so important for tribes to realize now that that is an absolute resource, and the tribe should have the ability to apply for that and receive those on their tribal lands, and in some cases Aboriginal territory, because there's exemptions and reasons for that. So there should be money set aside, there should be spectrum set aside, but that specific frequency will depend on where they're at.
Anything, Davida?
Yes, well, so I don't work with Spectrum per se, but I know that there's, as Linnea said, there always should be, dedicated funding towards tribal efforts. And I think there's one right now, actually, there's one actually in digital equity. The Affordable Connectivity Program is a program that is supposed to help folks have affordable internet, right? So they have subsidies that can, a subsidized rate. So if you go to your ISP and you qualify, you can get $30 off your internet service. But if you're on tribal lands, you can get $75 off, which is awesome, right? The only thing is that our tribal communities don't know about it, which is one problem. So we're, hopefully managing that to make sure that people know about the ACP program and that they're taking advantage of it and having people there to help them sign up. The other thing too is that, so that benefit is there, yes, but then the companies who issue those, who are supposed to subsidize, help subsidize and work with folks, sign up for the ACP and everything, they don't know the difference between tribal and non-tribal land. So they're not giving them the benefit. They're not giving them that 75. They're only giving them the $30 benefit. So ensuring that folks who are working with these companies who are signing people up for ACP are well equipped to work with folks who work on these lands. I think that's really evident right now, and something that we're working towards in terms of making sure that these ISPs, internet service providers, are doing a better job of administering these programs that are now and existing. So I think this dedicated Indigenous funding or tribal funding that's out there is there, but I think also the follow through is definitely important. It's not enough to say that we have these programs that exist, but also make sure that they're successful in how they're being outputted to the end user, which is of course our tribal communities as well.
Chief James?
I absolutely agree with everything that's been said, and also with your question. I think yes to all of the above. I think that we need to have a management of the spectrum, of the Indigenous spectrum. There needs to be, it needs to be land-based somewhere, and it needs to have a full team of management and research. It's a resource that we haven't even begun to understand where we could go with it, with our young people can go with it. I mean, handed something digital to a kid and they figured it out faster than you did. If we hand them the spectrum, come out of that. We have no idea. I heard recently a place called Bella Coola, they gave the kids the ability to write web pages, no instruction, and some of the stuff that came out of there was amazing. It was out of their minds. Not out of their minds, but it was from their created from their minds. Anyway, so like I said before, necessity is the mother of invention, but I think that we need to have some place that is in Canada and the US and maybe a global place where it can be managed, and all of the opportunities, all of the wise practices coming forward out of there can be shared immediately. So that we have, if there's something that doesn't go in the right direction and we're looking at it, we can immediately inform the rest of the nations, listen, don't go there. And I think we would save a lot of time and effort and money. So yes, to all of those. And I just wanted to just say that, one of the things that we have that's out of our control in Canada right now is that they're saying, well, you're 120 kilometers or closer to the US border. Before the borders came, the Indigenous people didn't know those borders. And yet we're still being stuck behind these borders, saying you cannot have a space on the UHF spectrum if you're less than 120 kilometers. Well, my community is, but it's our territory that's out there. We know nobody lives there. but the government is trying to hold us down to these age-old restrictions that were built in the 1950s, and and then they're still trying to promise us connectivity, and it's not working. So the last thing, because you said no acronyms, I wanted to say the RRBS is part of the white space, or the UHF spectrum that we need to be looking for, and it's called the Rural Remote Broadband System. But in Canada now, they've allowed, because the other one is white space. The RRBS, I've coined red space. So if you ever, in Canada has accepted it as a term for RRBS now, the Royal Remote Broadband System. So if you hear me talk about red space, it's intentional, because they talk about the white paper, and in Canada we had the red paper afterwards. And so I just wanted to let you know that if I say red space, I'm not trying to hide the acronym, I just can't get it out as smoothly as I can. Red space, Cooksham.
So I'm mindful of the time because we're going to be wrapping up, but I did want to sort of maybe highlight one minor success in the Council of Canadian Academies Waiting to Connect report that was released just over a year ago, where in that report it spoke to the fact that the government sort of, I guess, telecoms sort of sector designed by policy and programs has effectively led to racist outcomes for rural, remote, northern, Indigenous Canada. And what I do think, I agree with many of our leaders are now saying is nothing about us without us. And that includes, the telecom sector, and includes building the digital economy. So I do have approximately 5 minutes, for if anyone wants to ask a question, because we do want to try to make this interactive. There's a couple questions over there. Do you want to take my mic? Oh, there's a mic there. And just say your name before you ask your question, if you don't mind.
Thank you. My name is E.J. John, and I'm with the American Indian Policy Institute out of Arizona State University. And I really like what you all had to say. Thank you for your words and your thoughts. So a lot of the talk is kind of like around getting that connection to our communities. What happens after you get that connection? What does data sovereignty look like afterwards?
I was going to say, well, I think we need to share our stories of how it's working within our communities. How does it work with the end user? Are we actually serving them? So I think sharing our stories, and that's people in our communities who are working with the broadband and how they're using it in a good way, and also, the gaps that we see, or even the disadvantages of it that might even happen too, because I think there's good and bad when we have connectivity. And what is the next step too, whether that be getting appropriate devices, or if we need to look at how we are even managing it in terms of meeting our needs and putting it out in a good way, if that makes sense, in terms of maybe our cultural content, what should go on there, what should go not. So I think that is going to be telling in terms of the next generation of how we're using it and managing it, for sure. So that's what I can say.
So what I would say is, I think it's going to always be evolving, right? So if you talk about Hoopa, you just talk about like those providers that, the Verizon hotspots, right? The things that were not working, the options for satellite. So when I first moved back to the reservation, those were my options. And I couldn't even stream, and even to pay bills, it took like hours to get from one website to the next. But I think the network will constantly be evolving. We started at wireless. We received a fiber to the home grant, which we're implementing. A lot of that comes with the environmental and the design that has to come. So we're years out from that, but that's the next step. Then we're looking in how is this impacting, our medical facilities, our tribal governments, our cultural resources. So I think that's always evolving. The education, you want to build up from, the high school level or even younger on how that's going to be, because we need the newer generation of digital leaders to come up. our tribe struggles with, so when you talk about data sovereignty, you need that server space, you need those buildings. And I think a lot of the tribal people here can say that we don't have that infrastructure a lot of times, right? We might even struggle with housing for our tribal communities. So having like an appropriate data center and servers and those things that come along with data retention, having things backed up into the cloud, digitizing your tribal records and, you know, all of those things. So you need that infrastructure. So I think it's going to holistically evolve as the network upgrades, but we need that infrastructure again to build out and make those things possible.
Thanks, EJ, for your question. I think that the door, once the door is opened, and we are opening it, we're kicking it wide open, I think that the opportunities are going to be endless. I think that we don't know yet, and I think that that's where we need to make sure that we're focusing on. It's like if this is a window of opportunity, it's so big you can't even see the frame. So that's what we need to make sure, that we're not minimizing what next, but at the same time we're also welcoming, you know, things like ecotourism that happens in the outback that can't happen without somebody needing to know where somebody is. Maybe sometimes there's all the different small pieces of the puzzle that will actually, I think, interplay. But it's kind of like a vacuum cleaner salesman. Once you invite him in and say, "What do you want?" He says, "Well, I've never got this far before," right? You know, they're like, "What are we doing here?" Right? So we got to make sure that we're able to figure out that question after we're in. But it's a good question, yeah.
And maybe I'll just add is that I remember up in Barrow where I had attended a conference, and how having access to fiber internet really allowed also that community to create a whole bunch of cultural related apps, you know, with respect to language and videos and songs and performances and uploading it and sharing it, and it was fantastic. I can also tell you that it allows us to even, you know, use that technology for environmental monitoring or protection, for our hunters, the conditions of ice and transportation, what's happening in a marine environment, but also with NORAD modernization, with, you know, sort of in the Arctic at least, is telecommunications is really important for the military with respect to all domain awareness, knowing exactly what's happening not only on our lands, but in our air and in our marine environment. And data is the new oil. And so there is going to be a real opportunity to figure out what to do with that data. There's a lot of data that and research being done, but right now we need to start building what I would say is that Indigenous data sovereignty that someone spoke to. So we own that data, we control that data, and that we determine who has access to that data and for what purposes, and that we're no longer living in poverty, but we actually create a wealth and prosperity around participating in the sector. So I think what bothers me the most is when I work in the sector is that I often hear is that, you know, one, we don't deserve to be part of the modern, you know, economy, and second of all is that it's going to ruin our culture. And there are, you know, things to be aware and concerned of, just as every other culture has to deal with, you know, teaching our children about sort of, you know, what is good and safe use of the access to the internet and how do you protect them. But that is not, you know, we need to be able to modernize as well. There was another one quick question, and then I'm going to close it because we're running out of time. I thought. Oh, he asked the same one? Okay, maybe that's it. Excellent. I just want to thank everyone for an amazing panel and opening up the session in such a good way, and for promoting Indigenous, not only sort of sovereignty, but also honoring it. Because I think that concept of, you know, we have such a role to play, and we're going to use it in our own way, and our children, you know, are just producing the most fantastical sort of apps and uses, and I'm so proud of the fact that they have, when they do have access to it, that they're producing this amazing content for us all. So thank you.